Reading with your kids.
Hola, niha, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moni wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful and historic neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so honored and so wicked happy that you're joining us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show, and please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Good Pods, Podcast Addict, wherever you find your podcasts. Join us right now from beautiful Long Island in New York. Our guest is here today to share some really powerful information for us, information that we can use to help empower our kids. We'll be talking about learning myths and the power of behavior science for accelerating reading skills. Please welcome to the podcast, Dr. Kimberly Berens. Hey, Dr. Kimberly, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm really excited to have you on. I guess we've talked a lot here on the podcast about myths and stories, but those were like fun stories. I have a feeling that a learning myth, it's not so fun because, a lot of kids get caught up and their lives are changed in not great ways.
Absolutely. I will say that even though myths can be really fun, right? Mm-hmm. Like we love myths. I mean, Greek mythology and, those kinds of things, that magical, mystical stuff is very fun. But when we apply myths to, the behavior of human beings in a manner that basically blocks, any solutions from being applied, that can be very devastating. And so particularly in the area of education, when you're talking about kids who need to learn skills and not just learn them, but master them, it's really important to understand learning as a scientific process and kind of move beyond the mythological beliefs, the culture and to be quite frank, even people in the educational establishment and the psychological establishment believe about learning. A lot of that's mythological. And it's, science gives you access to power. And that's my goal is, my entire goal in my career is empowering students, empowering parents, empowering educators by, by giving them the gift of distinguishing the true science behind the learning process and how you can harness that to design highly effective instruction for learners.
Well, I'm really excited about this. I've done a little bit of studying into the science of learning, and the pandemic was something that just the way a lot of the educational establishment responded to the pandemic just baffled me. And I'm like, no, you guys, this isn't right. You guys are trying to create something that already exists. But anyways, talk a little bit about some of the myths, especially the myths that relate to our younger kids and the kids who are starting to learn how to read.
Right. So, especially with respect to reading, I think, one of the most devastating myths stems from, unfortunately, developmental psychology, which has very much influenced education and how really schools are designed. That myth is that kids learn via their development, or kids acquire skills as a function of their physical development. So the older a child gets, their age determines what skills they can perform. And, so the belief being that kids are born with some mechanism in their brain that simply unfolds over time, because, you'll hear people say, oh, that child's not ready to read yet, but they'll be ready to read in a year or so, right? Like a lot of kids in kindergarten, first grade are struggling. Like you'll hear teachers say, well, they're just not ready yet. They'll be ready next year. And that comes from the fact that they've been trained to believe that it's a child's age that actually determines when they read, rather than what actually determines if a child reads, which is that they've actually learned the fundamental skills of reading and have mastered those skills. Reading is not a genetic ability. Like, we're not born, and this is not just supported by behavior science, but it's supported in neuroscience, and it's supported in a field called epigenetics, which is the new field of genes, which is led to our understanding that genes don't do anything on their own. Genes interact with an environment, a behaving organism in their environment, and are turned on or off because of that interaction. So epigenetics, neuroscience, behavior science, we all know that that we're not born with the ability to read. That is a skill that's acquired via instruction, not genetics. But unfortunately, the public and teachers have been led to believe that that's not true, and that kids are born with a reading ability that unfolds itself as a child develops over time, which isn't true. So kids have to learn to read. Reading is an invention. We've invented reading as human beings. Humans have invented that as a means of passing down information and organizing the world. And when you talk about those kinds of human inventions, well, human inventions have to be taught via instruction. So kids who aren't reading in kindergarten aren't going to just magically start reading in a year because they grow older. They're not going to start reading unless someone teaches them the fundamentals of reading and gives them the type of practice opportunities they need to master those fundamental skills. So that's a big myth, and it's really damaging.
It blows me. I certainly agree that myth exists because I've seen it.
Right.
But it blows me away, and I've never made this connection before. It blows me away that it does exist, because those same teachers who might say, well, that kid's not ready to read, that 5-year-old's not ready to read yet. They'll be ready to read when they're in first grade and when they're 6 or 7.
Right.
When they also see kids who come into their kindergarten at 4.5 who are reading.
Exactly.
And they know, and every teacher that I've ever spoken to will tell me that kids who are read to every day when they're younger, they're reading quicker. They're developing all these words, get this vocabulary, and they're the ones who come into kindergarten reading. So it's kind of like,
but there's also that tendency, and I agree that in general, the teachers and the public understand the importance of enrichment, right? Like that type of environment a child is born into, and that environment enhances, the acquisition of skills like reading. But then there's also that tendency we have in our culture to attribute those kinds of early readers to talent or IQ or giftedness, right? So you might have that 5-year-old who comes in, like both my kids were reading chapter books by kindergarten, not because they were talented. I mean, this isn't to insult my children, but it had nothing to do with them being talented and gifted and like super high IQs. That had nothing to do with it. The reason they were reading chapter books is because I'm a professional and I know how it can be hit or miss whether or not kids actually get good reading instruction in schools and actually learn to read well. And I wasn't taking that chance because this is my entire career. This is what I do for a living. So I was like, I'm going to just, cut that. I'm just going to do a preventative thing, and I'm going to start making sure my kids get really strong foundational reading skills done when they're 3, 4, and 5 myself. And that's why they walked into kindergarten reading chapter books. But I'll tell you that the teachers that experienced my kids reading chapter books, they attributed that to their talent, to their IQ, to them being gifted kids. And so that's another tendency we have, is to kind of admire a child for their strengths and then blame a child for their weaknesses, right? Like, so if a child isn't reading or is struggling, maybe they have a learning disability. Maybe they have a low IQ. Maybe they're not motivated. Maybe they're lazy. Maybe they don't try. We have this tendency as human beings to attribute these kinds of personality traits and characteristics to, skills, to strengths and weaknesses. And what we know, again, in the science of learning, which includes behavior science, neuroscience, and epigenetics, I would say all 3 of those sciences are learning sciences. What we know of in all 3 of those fields is actually, unrelated to genes and intelligence. It's the number one most crucial determinant of a child's acquisition of skills is the environment, is what opportunities are they having to repeatedly practice essential skills, and the type of reinforcement they're receiving for doing those things, such that they actually master and acquire skills. That's what creates kids to be ahead of the game. And so we have that tendency to want to attribute things to, these characteristics that unfortunately we can't control those, but we can control how many opportunities we're giving kids to practice things and how good our instruction is. Those are the things that we can control and change if things aren't working, which is what I like to focus on. It's very pragmatic, the scientific approach.
So let's talk about the scientific approach to reading and helping our 3, 4, 5-year-olds, or even more importantly, I guess, our 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders who didn't get those skills. And, we hear that kids from kindergarten to 2nd grade are learning to read, and then once they hit 3rd grade, they have to read to learn. And if they haven't, well, there's no one going to help them acquire those skills. So what can we do?
So I'll tell you, I run an organization called Fit Learning. I'm the founder, and I've been doing this for 25 years. We started Fit in 1998. And, we've been rapidly accelerating readers for over 2 decades. And I'm working with adult readers. I'm working with college readers. I'm working with high school readers. I'm working with middle school readers, elementary school readers, and what we call little fits. And so those are my 3 to 5-year-olds who aren't readers. I love that because we're getting them fresh. No one's messed with them yet. So we're just teaching them to read from nothing. But the kids who've already someone's tried to teach them to read and hasn't done a great job, those are the kids, that we're working with a lot. And I'll tell you right now, it doesn't matter how old a person is. If that person failed to acquire mastery of essential foundational reading skills, and what I mean is phonics, number 1, phonics, and number 2, applying phonics for the decoding of words that follow phonetic patterns, of which a majority of the English language involves those words. Now, there are some exceptions, but the majority of words are what we call decodable. So if kids have missed the opportunity to learn how to decode, if they've missed the opportunity to acquire mastery of phonics, I don't care what grade they're in. That's why they're not reading well. And sight reading there are kids who are unbelievable memorizers, and there's kids who have unbelievable sight reading repertoires, but that's always going to be a limited skill set if you come across a word that you've never had the opportunity to memorize. If you've never had the opportunity to memorize a word because you've never seen it before, then you're in trouble. And we never want a person to have a, quote unquote handicap in their life, meaning that they have a deficit that's never been addressed that they have to cope with now forever. And I'm telling you, I'm a PhD, I'm a high level person, and I read very high level material from neuroscience, from behavior science, from epigenetics. I read a lot of scientific journals. And I'll tell you right now, I use my decoding skills all the time. And I am I'll be telling you, I'm almost 50 years old. I'm an old lady. And I'm a very fluent reader. I have, my entire life has involved reading a lot of things very fast. But I'm still using decoding. When I come across a very weird word in a scientific journal a term for something I've never heard of, guess what I'm doing? I'm decoding that. I'm breaking that down. And so if you don't have the ability to do that, then you're immediately impacted by your ability to, number 1, continue your reading flow and maintain comprehension. Number 2, when you have to stop and stumble and you're like, I don't know that word, and you have no strategy to use, well, forget it. Your attention is gone. Your concentration is gone. You've missed the meaning of, your comprehension is gone. And you're also missing out on the opportunity of learning a new word on your own in that moment and acquiring a new vocabulary word, acquiring a new, something new in your repertoire that you can then build upon. So, we at Fit Learning and in behavior science, we call a skill like phonics and decoding to be what we call a generative skill, meaning it's a skill that when you train it, you get lots of free outcomes. It generates all these untrained repertoires because it's so essential and important. So like when you give a kid a rule, like they're fluent in phonics and they learn the difference between a short and a long vowel word, right? You only have to give them the opportunity to practice fluently decoding a small subset of short and long vowel words. And then then they have the ability to automatically and effortlessly decode any long and short vowel word they come across because it matches the pattern and they're fluent with the pattern. And so you get kids who can then freely decode and understand unknown words in text because you've given them this foundational strategy. So it doesn't matter what age a kid is, and this is another thing that comes from developmental psychology. If a sixth grader is struggling with reading and like we do these very comprehensive reading assessments on kids that identify these holes in their foundational repertoire, my sixth graders who are enrolled in reading with reading deficits are doing the same phonics and phonemic awareness stuff as my kindergartners, as my third graders, as my adult readers, as my college kids. Any of these kids who've missed this step, well, they need that step. And so I think the problem with trying to fix gaps in traditional education is no one wants to go backwards. No one wants to take a sixth grader back to where they actually are instructionally. And I don't care if they've been pushed ahead to sixth grade because that's what the rules tell them they're supposed to do and because their age. They're not functionally a sixth grader if they're actually still struggling with kindergarten, first and second grade skills. They're instructionally an elementary school level learner still. And so we actually need to be focusing less on grade level stuff and more on foundational skill stuff because it's I'm a musician. I play the classical guitar. And I'll tell you right now, just because I'm almost 50 doesn't mean that when I started playing classical guitar, I was going to be able to pick that guitar up and just play Schubert, which is a composer, and he, translated to classical guitar is highly complex. Guess how I learned to play the classical guitar? The same way a 6-year-old would learn to play classical guitar if they were starting to play the classical guitar. Scales, drills, and I still spend the majority of my practice on drills. So you're getting back to the age issue, which is somehow a sixth grader with reading deficits should be treated differently than a first grader with reading deficits. No, because the skill is the same. The foundational skills required to perform that skill are the same, regardless of what age they are. And so like an athlete who wants to start playing a new sport, well, they're going to learn the basics, just like even if they're learning to play rugby at 35, they're going to learn the same basics as a 5-year-old learning to play rugby. It's not about their age. It's about, do you have the foundational repertoire required to advance in this skill area? And if you don't, well, that's where we need to start. It's very pragmatic.
I can't argue with you. My beautiful wife taught for over 34 years, and she taught kids in special needs classes. I have this very vivid memory. She had a kid coming to her class. He was, age-wise, he was a 5th grader. And he came from a different country. He had never been to school a day in his life. And when he got to my beautiful wife's class, he couldn't count. But my wife was required by her boss to teach him long division because chronologically he was in 5th grade. And she would come home frustrated. I'm like going, well, you can't teach him long division because he doesn't know how to count.
He can't add. He can't multiply. He can't divide. It's just infuriating.
Yeah. Why is it? I have a couple of questions, but just quickly, why is it that we are like this? Well, the kid's 13, he's 15. He came to us from a different country. He's never been to school a day in his life, but we have to sit him down and give him a middle grade novel to read as opposed to sitting down with him and starting him at the basics.
Where he should be started. So I've written an entire book on this. The book is called Blind Spots, Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them. In my book, I explain the entire history of our educational system and kind of the ideology, which is a word for belief systems. So the belief systems that have really led to how our education system has, well, I hate to use the term evolved because it hasn't evolved very much, but how it has, why it is the way it is. And so I'm telling you that these beliefs that are held in the educational establishment about learning. The belief that if you're a certain age, well, you're supposed to learn this now. And if you can't learn this now, then there's something wrong with your brain. Then you have a learning disability. Then you're a special needs person. That is such an indoctrinated belief. And it's indoctrinated in the College of Education because, look, I've been a professor in the College of Ed here in Long Island. I've taught courses at the Long Island University CW Post campus. I was in the undergraduate education. I taught some as an adjunct in undergrad, and I taught some classes in their master's program. And I'll tell you right now, teachers are actually trained this way. They're trained to believe that age determines what skills kids should be learning. And it doesn't matter if they haven't mastered the prerequisites. If they can't, that's what they're supposed to be learning this year. And if they can't learn it, there's something wrong with the kid. Rather than, this is an historical issue that goes back, in behavior science, we see human beings as their learning histories. So what that means is a human being is the history they have had with respect to that skill. So the history being how they've been taught to do it, how much practice they've gotten doing it, and how good that practice has been, and how much reinforcement has been used to select and strengthen that skill. And we look at everything from that lens. So like when I have a kid who coming into FIT and they're a 10th, I've got plenty of these 10th grader and they're, they're failing math, of course, and I run a comprehensive math assessment on the kid, and guess what? The kid's still counting on their fingers when they add. They literally have zero understanding of basic fractions. I'm not talking advanced fractions. I'm talking what a numerator and denominator tells you. Like, they are so deficient in their core math skills, and they're not deficient in their core math skills because there's something wrong with them. They're deficient in their core math skills because that's how school's designed. School's designed to expose kids to lots of content, check boxes that they're, teachers are required to do this at certain times of the year. Check, 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 move on, move on, move on. End of the year happens and the kid advances a grade. It's completely irrelevant how the child's performing, if they've mastered any. That's not the point. The point is we've done our job of checking the boxes of things we're supposed to bring up in class and test these kids on. And then we're moving them ahead. And then, throughout the year, we've got to move to the next thing. It's time. We got to move on. We got to move on. And this all comes from this this ideology of age and genes and IQ as being the determining factor of learning, which it is not. And so, and there's no way to solve the problem unless that can shift. Because I do in-services for teachers. We do workshops for teachers. We go out, we provide, trainings for teachers in schools. And I'll tell you right now, none of what the skills we can give teachers on how to be unbelievably powerful and effective in the classroom are irrelevant if they still have to function inside that system. Because unless they're kindergarten and first grade teachers, then we can make it work. Mm-hmm. Because a kid's skills deficits kind of line up with where they're supposed to be in that grade anyway. But the minute you get above first grade, second, third, fourth, you get to be in trouble, because now teachers are expected to be teaching up here, and kids need to be being instructed and having practice designed for them on skills that are down here. And it just keeps, that's why, I also have a website. If you go to drkimberlyberens.com, and I have some data on there from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is kind of our big educational outcome assessment that's done in this country on cycles. And I've created some graphs for the public based on those data that are publicly available on how the proficiency rates actually decline throughout the course of schooling for American students. So what that means is a greater percentage of fourth graders score at the proficient level on that test when compared to sixth graders, and so forth. So every year, fourth, sixth, eighth, 12th, the number of kids scoring as proficient decreases. So it's actually a linear decline when you look at it on a graph. And of course it is. Why? Because as kids get moved up and up and up and up without prerequisite skill mastery, they become less and less and less able to master the skills required in the next grade. So their performance gets worse throughout the course of their education, rather than that's shocking. right? Like a very small percentage of 12th graders graduate at the proficient level because it's just that all of those years of being pushed along starts to really fall apart, which is why, a big initiative at Fit Learning right now are university, college, and community college partnerships, because you have these kids entering college and they still can't function. They're still functionally illiterate.
Yeah.
They have very deficient math skills and they can't write and they can't engage in critical thinking. So we're trying to work with kids who are entry-level college students to rapidly fix those problems because colleges are really struggling to find a pool of students that can actually perform well in their institutions. Yeah. It's kind of a mess.
It does, and I wish we had enough. I wish we had enough time to solve all that mess right now, but we don't.
No.
But we can encourage people to visit your website. You shared with us your personal website. Also, tell us where we can go to find out more about Fit Learning.
So you can go to www.fitlearning.com. And you'll find all the information about Fit Learning. We have locations in lots of cities, and we also provide very, very effective online instruction. So I'm based in New York, and we provide services all throughout the Northeast, and it's all online. And I'm actually launching a new website in January. It'll be fitlearningonline.com, because we provide all very effective online services. And that's really for families that can't access a location or where an online enrollment's more convenient. So lots of options for fixing this issue. And, when you use science like Fit Learning, and we have outcome data going back 25 years on this, we advance kids 1 to 2 years in 40 hours of training. So in a work week, what a typical work week is considered to be, people work a 40-hour work week. In that amount of time, we're moving kids 1 to 2 years in an academic skill. So 1 to 2 years growth in reading, 1 to 2 years growth in math, 1 to 2 years growth in critical thinking and comprehension, and 1 to 2 years growth in writing. We are doing that in a 40-hour period because we use science, because we do measurement of every single thing a child is performing with us and make database decisions on how it's going. We hold ourselves accountable for learning gains, not the learner. What that means is if a kid isn't making progress, because we have it on a chart and we can see their trajectory, we can see their slopes of their learning lines. And if they're not steep enough, then we make an instructional change. And we then see the impact of that change. And so when you're acting like scientists, that's why people, we call ourselves scientist educators, because we're educating students, but in the act of educating them, we're acting as scientists. And that gives you so much power to be profoundly effective and move kids so rapidly. And that's what we have to have, because when you talk about COVID learning loss, you can't do the same stuff, man, that isn't moving. Most kids aren't even advancing a year in most school settings. So we're talking about having to accelerate kids 1, 2, 3 years to make up these learning gaps. Well, that means you have to provide exponential growth. That's, exponential means multiply. That means you have to be multiplying change, and you can't do that without science on your side. It's not possible. You can't do that with magic and myths and beliefs and theories and hopes. You can only do that with science. And I can't emphasize that enough.
Well, let's make another date to have you come back on, because we have a lot to talk about. In the meantime, I want to encourage everybody to check out Dr. Kimberly's websites and check out Fit Learning, because this has been a fascinating conversation. A lot of what we've talked about here on the Reading with Your Kids podcast, I'm remembering my conversation with Malcolm Mitchell, who is a former Super Bowl champion with the New England Patriots,
Awesome.
Who arrived at college and couldn't read. But he taught himself to read through children's picture books. And now he is an accomplished athlete and business person and author. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah,
I love this.
yeah. So, hey, Dr. Kimberly Berens, thank you so much for being part of our podcast.
Thank you so much. I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast, and will join us for the next exciting episode of the show. We are so grateful that you're part of our beautiful Reading with Your Kids family. We'd love for you to connect with us on social media, facebook.com/readingwithyourkids, @readingwithyourkids on Instagram, at Jedly Magic on Twitter. If you are on LinkedIn, please connect with Jed Doherty. We also have a Reading with Your Kids page on LinkedIn. We would love for you to visit our website, readingwithyourkids.com. Authors, click on the Authors Click Here button to find out how you can be a guest here in the show and find out how we can help you celebrate your book with the world. And also, parents, please be sure to visit readingwithyourkids.com to download our free online magazine. Hey, we want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we want to start by thanking our amazing guest. I also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Chris Doherty, Ann O'Leary, Soji Franklin. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And thank you so much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.